Okay, so let's talk about what we need to be aware of. Some of those things that have been of greatest concern recently and will remain so in the future. Of course, our customers in the vessel space are going to be calling us when they have emergencies, when they have what we call urgencies, which are more administrative in nature, for their exercises, of course, and just some other things to be mindful of with respect to how we interact with them for customer service, namely our level of professionalism. So first, let's talk a little bit about emergencies. Obviously, they're going to be calling our command center to get a hold of a qualified individual per their vessel response plans when they have an oil spill, a discharge of oil pollution. Now, for our non-tank vessels, that means their fuel oil, because that's the only kind of bulk oil they have on board is their fuel. It could be fuel in their hydraulic lines and other things. For non-tank vessels, it's oftentimes if they're not involved in a collision or something where it's opened up one of their fuel tanks, it's because it was during what they call bunkering or filling up with fuel, a fuel transfer. We also have a lot of vessels who actually carry chemicals. They're called chemical tankers or product tankers that are certified by the Coast Guard to carry either oil products or chemical products. Many of these chemical products have what we call a reportable quantity. Well, while the reportable quantity for an oil-based petroleum product is that it makes a sheen on the water, that's not the case for chemical spills. They have a certain amount, a threshold amount, and these are found in the regulations in 49 CFR. And so it gets a little more complex if we are getting a notification that there's been a chemical spill or a spill and the product happens to be a chemical. So we need to be aware of those because we are not going to report those necessarily the same way. There's going to need to be a level of verification to find out if the chemical meets the threshold quantity to be reportable to the Coast Guard and other authorities. So this is something where definitely the duty incident commander, qualified individual, or as we know them, ERCs, need to be involved. We do have a separate process and protocol for those that should be followed. We don't have a lot of chemical tankers, but we do have enough that, and many of them operate here in the Port of Houston, actually. Something else are the gas carriers. We have an increasing number of vessels that carry LNG or LPG and other gases like butane and stuff. And those, obviously, when they report a spill, it's still in a gas form. It's a release. It does not necessarily cause a spill into the water. And therefore, again, these are things that if you get a call like that as a watchstander or you are the ERC on duty, you need to be mindful of the process and procedures, what a reportable quantity is, and what the company or customer wants us to report or not report. Oftentimes they want us to report to them before we make any further notifications. So these are things just to be savvy of that are outliers to our normal process and procedure of an oil spill. A lot of times they're going to be calling because they have a collision, which they ran into another boat or vessel, and a collision, they hit something that's not moving. Nobody's ever done that before in a car, right? Groundings, which means they've touched the bottom for whatever reason, it was not as deep as they thought it was supposed to be, a fire, etc. They also, if there is any kind of the propulsion equipment that makes the vessel move, if it's not operational, that is considered a substantial threat of discharge, because if they can't stop or make way to avoid a collision or other things or a grounding, then obviously they could very quickly get into some trouble and have a discharge, a pollution discharge event. If there's any injuries, they're supposed to report those. And ultimately, for anything else, that they need to ensure that they're activating their VRP, which means they're calling us, notifying us so that we can get our duty incident commanders as QIs abreast of what's going on, get them the support they need, ensure that as watchstanders we're making the proper regulatory notifications, and that separately we're getting the salvage, marine firefighting, and or oil spill response equipment deployed and staged, and getting a person, a QI or ERC, out to the scene to get eyes on what's going on. Not all activations go that far to have them actively manage on site an incident, but depends on the scale or size of the discharge event. But it's important that we are prepared to do so every time a call comes in. So the Coast Guard has an actual regulatory definition of what a substantial threat of a discharge is, and we provide this to the masters on the fleets of our vessel clients so that they're aware that they have a responsibility if any one of the 12 things on this list are happening to them and their vessels, that they should be calling the QI or O'Brien's number to get us involved. Now, do they do this always? No. Do any one of these 12 items necessarily always end up with a pollution event, a discharge in the water? Absolutely not. But they can. And because of that, the Coast Guard wants them to activate their vessel response plan and make the notifications. Okay, they can choose not to, or they can ask us not to make the notification, or the ERC, under the management of the current response group, can make a determination if we don't need to make the notifications, if it was contained on deck and things of that nature. But that's not something that's going to happen at the watchstander level, and not necessarily at the ERC, QI, duty incident commander level. That's something that will be pushed up the chain of command internally, and oftentimes a dialogue with the client will ensue before we make a determination of not to make a regulatory notification, due to the fact that we have contractual obligations with these customers to make the notifications and follow their wishes. We don't want to be found in breach of our contract with them. And also, we don't want to recommend that they do or do not do something, make a notification that in which they could later receive a violation for. So there's a lot of legal consequences that can arise, so we need to follow our processes. So what happens next on board the vessel? Well, in these master's guides, from which these tables come from, we spell out what the masters should do specifically. We share this with you because we want you to know what we're telling them to do, because you're going to be getting a call and interfacing with them. Now, this particular slide, you'll notice, has the 985 number in it. I need to update that. The current guide that they have out there does have the new 281-606-4818 number. Okay, so just be aware of that is our primary number for the vessel customers. The alternate number, because we need to always have an alternate, remains the 985-781-0804 number. So vessel customers can and will call you on either one of those lines. All right. This is to help them understand the expectations of what they should expect. So the next box below in the table is a listing in order of the things that they should be expected to be asked by the watchstander, right? And so they may not understand that we have watchstanders and ERCs who are actually QIs and duty incident commanders. A lot of that terminology is not in their wheelhouse, okay? They just think they're calling O'Brien's, who's their QI. So if we can be mindful of that, if they ask if you're the QI as a watchstander, you should say, yes, this is O'Brien's, we're your qualified individual. You should not say, oh no, I'm not the QI. Let me put you on hold and I'll transfer you to the ERC. They're going to be wondering, what are you talking about? Did they call the wrong number? So if we understand these things, it helps us to better be able to communicate with them, right? So at any time, if we find that this list that we have in our guide of what you're going to be asking them as a watchstander to forward on to the ERC or duty QI incident commander, then we can update this because we want the flow to be in the proper order, because it'll make it easier. If they know you're going to ask them what their name is first, they're going to be ready to give you their name. If they know you're going to ask for the telephone number next, they'll have the digits ready to go. Okay, so contextually, if you're having a hard time understanding their accent and other things like that, or the line isn't real clear because they're using a Marsat line or something, then at least you can be assured that you're both working from the same list, top to bottom, right? Even though your format looks a little bit different than this. So this is supposed to be a help, and at any point, if we identify that we've changed the order, how we want to ask the questions in the command center, then we just need to know so we can update these guides, because this will help you have to hopefully use the phonetic alphabet a bit less, because it becomes very time consuming, right, to do so. So this is why we have it there. And a VRP activation, again, I started to expound upon this before. We are bound, we as in O'Brien's, are bound contractually to our customers and clients to follow the approved plan that we've submitted to the Coast Guard and they've approved. That means all notifications must be done in a timely manner if they're required. Again, that goes back to, is it a reportable quantity if it's a chemical or gas? That takes further knowledge and research to be done by the ERC, duty qualified individual, incident commander, and or the management team. Okay, they might involve us and from vessels with that as well. Okay. Also, it includes notifications to OSROs and salvors being firefighters. Okay, OSROs being the oil spill response or removal organizations, about what is going to be deployed, personnel, equipment, and such. At times, a client's going to request that we either delay making notifications or deploying resources, but what we need to understand is when we activate a VRP, we are bound to follow the VRP unless we're going to revise it, okay? And that would have had to have been done in advance. So we don't have a choice on whether to make, even if we want to call them courtesy notifications to the OSRO and salvors. That should always be done. And I say that for the benefit of the ERCs, because I know sometimes we've deviated from that in the past, but the Coast Guard is pushing very hard and have made a very clear message, both at the headquarter levels and at the individual sector port levels, that there's no exceptions. Okay, now we can call out one of the salvors and say, hey, we're notifying you out of courtesy that we have an event going on. At this point, they're not ready to activate any of the salvage services, but we want to, get you in the loop of what's going on. And as we move forward in this and have more information, we'll let you know. That we are required to do per the plan. Okay. If we're not going to do something like that, then that means we have to get a deviation approved in writing from the local Coast Guard captain of the port if we're not going to make a notification, or if we choose not to ultimately deploy resources from the identified providers, the OSRO or salvors in the plans. So the courtesy notification absolutely has to be done. Secondarily, if we're ever going to deviate, not activate them and use their resource or equipment, or want to use others, subcontractors, that has to also be approved by the local Coast Guard captain of the port, okay, before we can proceed in doing so. So just to be clear, this is a bit beyond the watch standards, but this is more important for the duty QIIC, our ERCs. You need to understand this and follow this guidance religiously. Now, moving on to our urgencies, oftentimes we get these emails, communications, phone calls, where the client will write urgent, urgent, urgent. We often get to understand how urgent it is to them by how many times they write that. Well, these are typically administrative in nature. It may be that they don't have copies of their approval letters, that they don't know if their COFR is still valid, their certificate of financial responsibility. which is a certificate that says that they have insurance in place if they had a spill. So that's pretty important. You shouldn't be driving your car without car insurance, right? Well, they shouldn't be operating these vessels in U.S. waters without having insurance coverage to pay for something that happens. And we talked about how much those assets, those vessels cost to build and maintain, and the cost of the cargo on them definitely need to be insured, right? We're not just playing bumper boats out there. So vessel general permit, that's another thing that they have to have in place for incidental discharges, not a pollution discharge so much, but these other things that happen from time to time within state waters. Of course, there's additional requirements like for the state of California, and they have their own COFR as well and state plans. So we work with that as well as Alaska. And particularly Alaska alternative planning criteria has been something that there's been a lot of communication on, enrolling vessels into with the provider there and confirming coverage. So we see a lot of email traffic and such, and we want you to be aware of it because it's often a possibility that in after hours, at night, weekends, holidays, and at the command center email address, you might see some of these things. It's pretty common. Now, if the matter absolutely cannot wait until the next business day, then notify the vessel duty team, right? The after hours team. Or if you want, just provide them our contact info. Start with the first person on the list and give that phone number directly to the caller and let them call us, and we'll work through and assist them with these things. Oftentimes what we do is we just reassure them and we start researching it a bit, and we let them know that, yeah, we've either taken care of it already and we're waiting on the regulatory agencies, or we will do it as soon as the office is open the next business day. As you can imagine, if there's action that has to be taken on something administrative by a regulatory agency, it's not something that they're typically going to be doing after hours, the regulatory agency, so to speak. They don't work our hours, right? So they work bank hours, and therefore, oftentimes it's a little bit of dancing that we do on the phone with the customers, just letting them know to reassure them we're on it, and we'll be in touch and keep them abreast of it. And a lot of times these things come in through the command center because, of course, the company or customers are on the other side of the world in a different time zone, right? And they just miss our business hours to call us or email us, and so they might call into the command center for follow-up on these things. And they get a little bit anxious sometimes. And that might be an understatement. Something that's really making this a little bit more challenging recently is that Coast Guard headquarters, they have a staff of civilian and Coast Guard members that review the vessel response plans and approve them. So when we add a new vessel to a plan that's already approved or something, they're going to be doing a review process. Well, over the years, they've been able to whittle down that process to about, on average, 7 to 8 days. And we had seen turnarounds as slow as 3 or 4 days because we used Vessel Pro to submit them to them over the past 3 years. Well, they've decided, because they have increasing responsibilities and that they've kind of created a bit of a monster for themselves in expectations by industry, that they expedite requests and get them out within a week's time, that they've fallen back into the regulatory lead time that is in the regulations that says that they have up to 30 days to review and approve a revision to a plan. For a new plan, it has to be submitted 60 days in advance of operating in U.S. waters. So with this, they've been fairly strict on it. They have an overwhelming queue of plans to review and approve, as well as new plans to review and approve. This also includes expedited requests, okay? So companies that at the last minute try to add a vessel and want us to get it approved from the Coast Guard because they're on their way to the U.S. already, going to be here within a day, 2 days, a week, something like that. As you can imagine, we could manage these expectations fairly easily before, but with this culture change that the Coast Guard is attempting to enforce now, it's it's causing a lot of hassles, particularly in some cap in the port zones more than others. We have found that the Coast Guard is checking the notice of arrival system at headquarters when we've sent in a request with an ETA of the vessel saying it's, tomorrow, for example. And the Coast Guard, and we tell the Coast Guard, we just got this today. They say they're coming tomorrow. Coast Guard goes in and looks, well, we don't have a notice of arrival. And a notice of arrival has to be submitted 96 hours or 4 days in advance. So if they don't have a notice of arrival in the system, they're not going to be allowed to come into port. And so the Coast Guard doesn't prioritize it that quickly, right? And they've gone as far as having to look up on Port Vision and other providers like that, the AIS, the Automated Information System data, which tells the GPS lat-long location of where the vessel is at in the world. And they've found, and you're probably going to laugh at this, they found that vessels are like not even anywhere close to coming to the U.S. They've given us an ETA. One good example is a vessel was off the coast of Japan and it had an ETA for the next day. It was April 10th, I believe. This just happened last month. And the vessel master hadn't updated. He had a notice of arrival in the system with the Coast Guard to arrive on the 10th. We passed it on to the Coast Guard. It was the 9th. The customer was very, very upset. And in the end, the vessel was still sitting in Japan. And they needed to update the notice of arrival. Coast Guard checked the AIS data and found that it was in Japan and said, no, we're not going to process this until next week. The vessel can't even get here until maybe the 17th. Okay, customer is really upset because they had copied the charter's agent in on the notice of arrival. The master had done that. And so the charter is the person who has chartered out that vessel to bring that cargo. And so the ship management company is supposed to have an approved plan. Well, the charter wanted to know why the plan wasn't approved. And you can kind of start to understand how it starts to unravel and cause all kinds of repercussions, right? They might lose that charter in the future for not keeping their plans compliant in enough time. And that's a consequence that many are going to be needing to come to terms with. This is a significant change for what industry has come to expect over at least 3 years since 2014. And as a result, we, the vessels team, are juggling a lot of last-minute requests for vessel additions, in most cases when they're inbound to U.S. ports and they're not going to have an approval letter. Why do I want you to know this? Because they're going to be calling the after-hours lines too, blowing up our emails and everything else. It's not just going to be us, it's going to affect all of you. We want you to know that the Coast Guard's waiting until the notice of arrival is submitted and up to just about 24 hours, 48 hours before the vessel is due to arrive, before they start to issue those approvals on the expedited ones. And there's been some that they never even issued. They just gave a verbal from a local captain of the port to let them come in. And this is helping our clients go insane because they're afraid that at the last minute they're not going to be allowed to come in. And the vessel would go off hire, they would lose all that money, the potential to have the vessel chartered again. And so, this is a big deal, big change. So we want you to be aware of it. We don't want to get you anxious about it. We want you to know that we've got it under control. We're working with the Coast Guard. We have a process called a one-time waiver that we often submit when we get down to the 24-hour mark. And all the captain ports have been pretty good about that, except for Sector Miami, who is not accepting one-time waivers. So we have a few yachting customers, those large privately registered yachts that want to do it at the last minute, coming from the Caribbean, from Bahamas or something, and have been held out or delayed a little bit. But we're working through those things, and we'll continue to do so. But rely on the vessel management team and duty team. We'll take care of these things. We just want you to be aware if you see an increase in some of these issues. It's not that we're not doing our job like we always have. It's just that Coast Guard's kind of moving the target a little bit, right? And it's going to be a while that the customers are going to have a real problem with this. And by a while, I mean a year, 2 years. It's going to take a lot of them a while to get used to. There's really no way that most of them can provide us a vessel edition 30 days in advance of it coming to the U.S. unless they just automatically roll every vessel that they have in their fleets globally with us, which would be great because we'd make more money in our retainers. But they're always trying to cut costs because, again, we talked about how depressed the market has been over the past 10 years. Well, some other things that you might get emails and correspondence and calls about are, we don't need to go into detail about these, but alternate planning criteria, enrollment coverages going through Alaska, Guam, American Samoa, the average most probable discharge coverage, which is basically every company has to have for tank vessels only when they're discharging oil, petroleum products. They have to have this coverage with their OSRO, their Oil Spill Response or Removal Organization, in order to potentially pre-boom the vessel in states like Washington, okay, before they transfer cargo. But the coverage has to be there for them to be able to get boom around the vessel within 1 hour if they were to have a spill of 50 barrels or 1% of their cargo, and a skimmer in the water working within 2 hours to help clean up that oil inside the boom. Okay, so they'll email in about coverage requests and stuff, and really that's all handled by the OSRO, so we just pass that on to them. And they even copy us in on a lot of that kind of stuff to the command center, which is really not to us, we're just infoed, so to speak. There's a lot to do with ballast water management reports, as well as treatment systems working or not working, because there's been a big push from a compliance perspective on that recently. California shoreline protection coverages come up, notice of arrival and departure. Sometimes we get put in as the 24-hour contact because they might not have their local agent nominated yet. So they put in O'Brien's because they know we'll answer the phone. And then we get the Coast Guard. And this happens. I've seen it even a few times in the last 6 months where the Coast Guard is asking us to provide all this documentation that we don't manage because the local agent does. So we have to politely get back in touch with them and say, hey, you need to get back a hold of that vessel and have them tell you who their real local agent is, because it's not us. And we don't have the documents you're asking for. And then, of course, we deal with the vessel general permit issues that come up from time to time. Just understand any inquiries, forward them to the Vessel Services Duty Team. Talked about that before. inquiry@widowobriens.com. Send it all there. We'll vet it. We'll figure it out. We don't expect you to, have listened to this training and be, oh, that's that. I need to do this or this and that. That's not what we have you there for, to go through and determine all of these different things. We just really want you to know that, be aware of them and just send them on to us so that we can expeditiously take care of them. All right. And to notify us as well. If it's something that the customer's pretty adamant about, needs some assistance, or you see an email that you really feel from a customer service standpoint needs to be addressed, acknowledged, give us a phone call, wake us up so we can take care of it. All right? Thanks. This is a slide just about that AMPD coverage. I'll sit on it for a minute or two. But again, we give them this information in their master's guide that they contact MSRC or NRC or even Delaware Bay and River Cooperative in their area in the Delaware Bay, DBRC, directly. We're not involved in that. We don't need to be notified. We're not going to provide a confirmation. Don't call us unless you actually spill. But, they have to have these coverages in place. And there's actually places where they're offshore, near shore, doing what we call lightering, transferring cargo from one vessel to another, in which they have to pay an additional premium to their OSROs for this coverage, this AMPD coverage, because they might have to move a vessel or a response vessel, or personnel and equipment, booms and skimmers closer to the location in which they're doing these lightering operations, transferring over the water. As you can imagine, there's greater risk there. Okay. We do have these compliance tools, and anytime you see tables nested into this presentation, they're coming right from these tools, and we want you to be aware that we have these. We're going to make sure you all have copies of the latest ones. I'm going to put together on flash drives for the team, as well as we'll send updates to the EM team distribution, which the command center is party to. whenever we make updates through circulars and stuff to our customers. But we have the Master's Guide to U.S., Canada, Panama. We have a couple other guides for media and response in U.S. waters. But then we have 12 checklists where we've broken down more specifically things that are operational checklists that help them if they're going to Alaska, transiting Alaska, American Samoa, California, Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, Guam, Hawaii, Pacific Northwest like Oregon and Washington, right? And then topically, stuff like the Vessel General Permit, a Subchapter O endorsement for gas carriers or a chemical carrier checklist, the exercise checklist, and the ballast water management checklist, okay? So these are very helpful guides. You'll have them for referentially, so if you want to review them, it might be helpful as you see stuff come in, but not required. We just want you to have an awareness level and have the reference materials available to you. Ballast water management. So, this has been probably the hottest topic besides the issue going on with the Coast Guard approvals pushing out to 30 days. And this is that, all vessels have to have, if they're going to discharge ballast in U.S. waters within 12 nautical miles, a treatment system that's type approved by the Coast Guard or an alternate management system that has a foreign type approval. Coast Guard type approved systems, there's 6, and currently 8 more that the Coast Guard is reviewing in the last final stages of type approval, as well as over 60 alternate management or foreign type approved systems. And they can use the foreign type approved systems for 5 years, but they all have a compliance date in which they have to have a treatment system installed, okay? And if they're past that compliance date, they don't have an extension from the Coast Guard, then they have a bit of a problem. So they need to apply for and receive an extension that allows them to conduct what they call deep sea exchange, more than 200 nautical miles offshore and 2,000 meters of depth. They have to empty out all their ballast tanks, which help them, keep the vessel stable, and use deep sea water, because this is all about invasive species or foreign species coming into U.S. waters to try to prevent that, right? These treatment systems now, they have all kinds of them. Some are using UV to blast the water and irradiate any kind of microorganisms in the water. They have chemical treatments as well as filtration or a mixture of all of the above, okay? So there's a lot of questions about this that are coming in from our customers. These systems cost millions of dollars to install and then maintain and operate. So it's a big deal for our customers. And, those questions keep coming. And so you might see some of that come in through the command center or get passed over from a call in the middle of the night to one of us. So we just want you to know about that. And of course, ballast water management reports are going into what we call the NBIC, National Ballast Information Clearinghouse in Washington, D.C. Coast Guard has a group of people there too that are giving a heads up to the local sector units when they see reports come in where it doesn't look like vessels are in compliance, right? And so then we get those calls on how to help them. They have to keep a plan, just like we have a vessel response plan. They have to have a ballast water management plan that details what kind of treatment system they have or don't have, what they're doing to treat it. And the Coast Guard really takes a look at those when they inspect the vessels at a minimum on an annual basis. And then there's some states that require additional ballast water treatment requirements, okay? Think of California, Washington, Oregon, the West Coast, right? Primarily. So you're going to see that kind of stuff come in from time to time. Changing gears to alternative planning criteria, vessels transiting American Samoa, Guam, Southeast Alaska, and more importantly, the one you're going to see the most, Western Alaska, they have to have what's called alternative planning criteria. So what is this APC? Well, in some of these areas, the services that are identified in a vessel response plan are not fully and or readily available. So in the continental United States, all of these services are available by contract, right, from the shore side. And we provide some of these, as you can imagine, the QI, spill management team, right? And all the ones in green there are available in those remote areas I just mentioned. But the rest of these are not so much readily available. Maybe to some degree or another, but not fully available um, to the extent that they're required and to get to a vessel offshore in the time needed, for example. So for those, they have to have alternative planning criteria. The big challenge here for industry is understanding when alternative planning criteria applies. And if you're transiting through a cap of the port zone, coming to a U.S. port or having just left a U.S. port, so one end of your voyage or the other is a U.S. port, then it's called transit passage per the Coast Guard. And that means they can enforce their authority to make you have an approval for whatever zones you transit through, even though you might not be calling port there, okay? Zones meaning captain of the port zones, to be specific. Whereas most countries would consider that innocent passage. Okay, so this is a wrinkle that the Coast Guard has that our customers don't like very much, okay? And just for a quick example, Western and Southeast Alaska, a lot of vessels are going to be operating through there on what we call the Great Circle Route, through the Aleutian Island chain, because our planet is a globe. And as you transit, you do it and you can burn less fuel if you go in a bit of an arc, okay, across there back and forth to the U.S. West Coast. You see Guam and Northern Marianas Islands and also American Samoa clear down the South Central Pacific. Okay, all these areas have limited resources, not enough for what the Coast Guard wants vessels to have available to them to contract with. So that means if they're going to transit through there coming to and from the United States, they have to contract with additional resources, put other measures in place, okay, to mitigate their risk. So if they're not on innocent passage and they go through Western Alaska, they have to enroll in APC. There's 3 approved providers out there that are in our checklist, and one of them in particular, the network, likes to send a lot of notifications to us to verify whether vessels are, in compliance or not. But that provider, the network, provides coverage specifically with for tank vessels, and it's the only provider for tank vessels, while the other 2 that compete with them do it only for non-tank vessels. Okay, so they have to enroll in APC, keep the certification information on board, and they have operating procedures they're supposed to follow. Okay, and so when they don't do that, they go within 75 miles of shore where they're not supposed to, or don't use a proper pass through the islands. We're going to get notified to help notify them to see what is going on, okay? Because we're the QI. So what we have to do is once they enroll in these, we have to update the response plan and provide them that kind of documentation too. But more than likely, if you get involved from the command center perspective or as a QI ERC, it's because the vessel's not doing what it needs to do. So the vessel service duty team can help and assist in all that. This is the challenge why there's different providers, because some providers are authorized for certain sub areas in Alaska and others are not. And as long as they follow the traditional Great Circle route, and if there's not bad weather, they're likely never to go into the Kodiak, Cook Inlet, or Prince William Sound areas. But the 2 non-tank only providers can only provide coverage in Aleutians, Bristol Bay, and Kodiak, okay? Whereas the other one, the network, provides for Prince William Sound and others. So if they were to deviate up for weather avoidance, which happens in the North Pacific quite a bit, they would not have coverage anymore, depending upon which provider they pick. Some of the challenges we see is, and you can see it depicted here, is that they're supposed to stay outside of 75 nautical miles. There are specific passes like through Unalaska that they could go through. But if they don't just go through there and get back out 75 nautical miles, there are beacons out there that are tracking their GIS, and that they alert the network, who in turn alerts the local Coast Guard. that there's something wrong, right? And this is where we get a lot of messages about they need to be outside of that. Now, they don't need APC. They don't need to enroll with any of those three companies if they stay out in this green area out here off 200 nautical miles. It's when they come inside there that they have to deal with it. Here's a vessel that was inside not just the 75-mile zone, but this blue line depicts the 12 nautical mile zone. The red's the 3, so they're just chilling out there, right? They probably were going to go through this pass over here to the left of the screen, but for whatever reason they deviated and they're going to go up to the next pass, but they're not authorized to be in this area. So they got a notification. We did too. They didn't have an APC provider at all. They weren't supposed to be there at all. They were on transit passage. So, we still find customers, this happened last year, that don't fully understand their requirements, and we have to help them get into compliance and, more importantly, do the things that they need to do operationally to mitigate their risk so they're not our next spill response, right? Coast Guard has some national planning guidance out there that we're working through. All of the existing APCs expire at the end of June, so you're going to see some circulars in the near future coming to the EM team distribution about this as we update those, okay? And the goal here is to make sure that there's an even playing field, that ultimately Coast Guard wants to increase oil spill response capabilities in these remote areas over time and get, some clarification on existing regulations and dealing with the concerns that are out there. Like I said, we'll let you know where we're at with those here in the near future. You're going to see some movement in the next month and a half, next 6 weeks. Exercise requirements. Don't forget about the Preparedness for Response Exercise Program. These are the VRP exercises. There's two, we look at it in two ways: the shipboard requirements on the vessels and the shoreside requirements. Okay, we take care of the shoreside requirements here for them with the IMTTDX, like the one we held here in Houston back in March. It was combined with the Salvage or Marine firefighting tabletop exercise, and their OSROs and Salvers will deploy equipment throughout the calendar year and handle that for them for the last one. But more importantly, the ones you're going to be dealing with are those shipboard exercises, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about those. In one of them, the RACE, the Remote Assessment and Consultation, the Coast Guard has proposed a revision that they're finalizing now to move it from per calendar year per vessel to be one vessel per fleet every 3 years, which means less call volume for us and less work for the salvers, right? So we expect that this is going to go into effect here in June or July, but we'll keep you posted because it's going to greatly affect the volume that comes through our command center, definitely. We're going to take another break right now before we jump into these exercises specifically. So I'm going to pause, and we'll come right back and start working through each one of these individually.